Me. I will quickly get my presentation up here. Let's see. I'll just share it this way. Okay. All right. Is everyone able to see this okay?
There you go. Now it's playing. Great.
Okay. Also, just kind of bear with me. I am kind of getting over a cough right now, so I might kind of be clearing my throat a little bit, and maybe even hopefully not coughing too much. All right. So my project is titled, or my presentation is titled, A Comprehensive Outlook on Occupational Therapy and Hoarding and Occupational Therapy Breakdown. All right, so some of our topics that we'll be discussing today are what is occupational therapy, models and frames of reference, what is hoarding disorder, literature and assessments, resources and future directions for OT within this area. So occupational therapy is a client-centered and occupation-based therapy. Client-centered means that we work to closely include our patients in the treatment plan and decision-making process so that they're involved in their care and goal setting. Oops. Occupation-based means that our interventions are geared towards improving the patient's ability to complete meaningful activities in their daily life. Examples of occupations that OTs focus on include activities of daily living, so feeding, bathing, showering, dressing, things like that, as well as instrumental activities of daily living, which include things such as childcare, caring for animals, maintaining finances, their household. And then we also have health management, rest and sleep, education, work, play, leisure, and social participation. So if you want more of a breakdown, I highly recommend referring to the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework, or the OTPF. It gives charts in the very back of each occupation specifically and kind of how OTs can address each of those categories. So we work in a large variety of settings, including inpatient and outpatient rehab, acute care, skilled nursing, community-based settings, home health, mental health, research and academia, pediatrics, schools, early intervention, and the NICU. So next up, I'm going to discuss some models that I kind of considered throughout my project that would fit well when working with individuals with hoarding disorder. But before we dive into the specific models, I want to give a definition to what a model is in occupational therapy practice. So OT models focus on how theory applies to occupational therapy practice, and it provides a lens to view a person's occupations through. So the first one we have here is the Person, Environment, Occupation, Performance, or the PEOP. This is very similar to the PEO, which is the Person, Environment, Occupation model, but it adds another component, which is performance. In this model, the practitioner considers the person, so their needs and wants, the person's environment, so perhaps their home, their occupation, so what activities they're wanting to participate in, and their performance, so how they're able to complete those activities and what is going well and what needs to be improved. This fits in with the context of hoarding disorder because in order to ultimately help the client perform well, we need to address each of these components. So for example, if we kind of look at performance first, like how is the client currently functioning? What systems do they have? And what is their reasoning for keeping their items? Their occupations, what are they engaging in? What's challenging? What's going well? Their environment, specifically their home, what aspects are fostering occupational engagement and what aspects are limiting their engagement? And lastly, but also most importantly, is the person. So what values do they hold and what matters most to them? Next up, we have the model of human occupation, or MOHO. So this model In this model, the client is seen as someone who is able to make change, reach their goals, and become a master of their physical and social environment through occupational engagement. This includes 3 main components, and it also focuses on motivation, skills, performance, and adaptation and change. I think this is just a really positive model, and I think it's very uplifting, especially to clients who might be, disappointed or overwhelmed with their situation. Lastly, the third model that I thought was most appropriate is the Canadian model of performance and engagement, or the CMOPE. This is a client-centered model that is highly collaborative between the therapist and the client. It has 3 main categories, including environment, occupation, and person. In this model, the client is the one who really directs the goal setting, and I think it's just a very unique perspective. All right. Next up, we have frames of reference. So these are more specific than models, and they kind of help link the theory to the intervention. The first 2 frames of reference that I have are a little bit more OT based, but I think that components of them could be applicable when working with a client in their home. So the biopsychosocial approach, it includes 7 main factors, which include injury characteristics, socio-demographic characteristics, biological factors, social contextual factors, biopsychosocial outcomes, and rehabilitation outcomes. So this is really useful if you have a client who has a physical handicap or injury, if they're recovering from a surgery or a stroke. It really looks at the biological side of things, the limitations they might have physically, but also because it has that psychosocial aspect, you're looking at their internal concerns and like maybe what is leading to the detriment in their environment and how that then affects their biological needs. Next up, we have the compensatory frame of reference. So this again really looks at home modification and using assistive devices. It works to modify the client's environment. So it's really focused on how can we make the environment work for the client. Lastly, we have the cognitive behavioral frame of reference. This considers 5 factors, including thoughts, behaviors, emotion, and mood, physiological responses, and environment. So this frame of reference considers how all of those aspects work together and affect each other. And it considers how it impacts the individual's thoughts and their beliefs. So this might be one of the most useful frames of references when working with those with HD, because it aligns well with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a common treatment for hoarding disorder. Next up, we have what is hoarding disorder? So it seems like most of the people here are fairly familiar with hoarding disorder. So I do have like the DSM-5 criteria listed, but since it seems like you are all familiar with the condition, I'll just not read through the entire diagnosis. As you may also know, the onset the onset is between 11 and 15 years of age, but it can also occur following trauma. And it is also often not recognized until later in life because it manifests physically before it's often diagnosed as a mental health concern. So oftentimes when someone is in their 30s to 50s, it's kind of when it becomes known. The prevalence, according to Stedeke and Frost, is between 2 to 6% of the population. There are also several comorbidities associated with hoarding disorder, including major depressive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and personality disorders. Hoarding disorder also affects men and women equally, and there are records of hoarding disorder within families indicating there may be a genetic component to the disorder. There are also a number of risks associated with the condition, including increased fall risk, decreased mobility, overall health and well-being concerns, increased risk of fire hazards, reduced ability for emergency medical services to reach the client during emergencies, decreased engagement in occupations such as ADLs and social engagement, family tensions, impairments related to work, and potential for infestations and structural damage to the home. So earlier this year, I was fortunate to attend the International OCD Foundation's Conference on Hoarding Disorder, and during their presentation, Hoarding, the Basics, Randy Frost and Gail Stedeke did a really great job of explaining. So I thought that sharing this might be valuable. So the first component of those who are at risk are those who are vulnerable. So this means that if someone has a first-degree relative with hoarding disorder, or if they grew up in an environment that was cluttered, they're more at risk for developing the condition themselves. Those with information processing difficulties, such as issues with attention, categorization, memory, perception, association, and complex thinking. And then also, these individuals may have attachments and beliefs about saving relating to their identity, opportunity, safety, feelings of responsibility with waste, and items beauty, and provoking positive or negative emotions. There's also a component of reinforcement through positive and negative emotions regarding their habits and possessions at times. So with all this in mind, one can acknowledge how complicated hoarding disorder is, the severity of the risks associated with the condition, as well as its complexity, lends itself to the importance of continuing to research the disorder itself, as well as finding effective approaches and treatments for hoarding disorder. Lastly, while I'm on this slide, I do want to point out that using person-first language when talking about this population is very important. Rather than calling an individual a hoarder, so to speak, it is more respectful to say someone who hoards, collects, saves, or has many items. Also, just having an honest conversation with your client about what they feel most comfortable with and respected by will help build trust and rapport from an early point in treatment. Likewise, when referring to a client's items, don't be derogatory towards labeling their items in a bad way as well. So avoiding terms like junk, trash, or garbage is always a good idea. Right. Next up, this was also something that I really thought was important from the ICD conference this summer, or sorry, last spring. So this was from the presentation by Bradiotis, Woody, and Larkin called "So You Think You Know How to Assess Hoarding?" And they basically just broke down the differences between disorganization, hoarding, and poor sanitation or Diogenes. So disorganization is characterized by a messy home. The home may be untidy, disorganized, and have items that are not put away. There may be a lack of distress or impairment at this stage, and daily activities are not compromised. All right, so then hoarding. Hoarding is a mental health condition that is characterized by intentional saving and acquiring due to emotional connections to possessions. The individual may consistently acquire items and will have difficulties reducing their possessions. The home reaches a point where it is dysfunctional for everyday tasks. And then lastly, rather than saying squalor, some individuals prefer to use the term poor sanitation or the acronym DEN, which stands for domestic environmental neglect, as there are fewer negative connotations and stigma associated with this term. Poor sanitation is characterized by filth, pests, rotting food, unhygienic conditions, and overall degradation of the environment. Poor sanitation may or may not be present with hoarding disorder, as each individual's case is different. In Diogenes, the client will often have a lack of insight into their living conditions. All right. This might also be an area that you're familiar with. It is the stages of hoarding. Sorry, the stages of hoarding clutter to hoarding scale. So this is actually included on my presentation with permission from the Institute for Challenging Disorganization. But I think unless you guys have questions, we can return to it later, but it basically goes through the different levels of severity from low all the way to severe for hoarding disorder. And I've also included a picture here, again, used with permission. Basically, it kind of defines the 5 levels as well as kind of breaks it down into different categories. So we have structure and zoning, animal and pests, household functions, health and safety, and personal protective equipment. All right, so as I was starting my project, one of the requirements for my class was to do a literature review. So I did a very deep dive into researching hoarding disorder, and these are the articles that I found that pertain specifically to hoarding and OT. So it is pretty limited, the specific literature for both of these topics combined. But I thought that the information here is a good start to having OT kind of step into this area of practice. So kind of the main points that I took from these articles are, especially in the first one here by Clark, she talked about how from an occupational therapy perspective, we can see that hoarding itself is in a way an occupation because it includes roles, routines, and meaning despite the detrimental side effects. And then within her article, she also kind of explored a number of occupation-based interventions. So, for example, taking pictures of items that are important to the client and then making a scrapbook. And I know this is sometimes perhaps pretty unrealistic as far as like doing a timeline sort of thing, but or due to like how much time you have to work with the client. But if the client is motivated and this sort of strategy works well for them, it's a good idea. And there were a few other occupation-based interventions, such as making like a t-shirt quilt, blanket. But again, like that could be difficult. Also, another point that I would like to share is from that second article by Kaipik et al. So in their article, they discussed non-sanctioned occupations. So this research defined non-sanctioned occupations as occupations that tend to be viewed as unhealthy, illegal, immoral, abnormal, undesired, unacceptable, and or inappropriate in a society's history and culture. While the researchers do not believe that all occupations should be accepted or necessarily encouraged, they do believe that all occupations, sanctioned and non-sanctioned, should be studied in the field of occupational therapy for a more comprehensive understanding of human engagement in daily life. The other articles just kind of talked about occupational therapists and their potential role in interdisciplinary teams, as well as improving quality of life through occupational engagement, and how intervention can also lead to improved functioning. In the final article I have listed here by Koenig, they specifically mention having non-psychiatric professionals working with those who have hoarding disorder. I would like to point out that OTs can work in psychiatric settings. I actually did do one of my fieldwork rotations at an inpatient psychiatric facility. So that is definitely an area of practice that OTs can work in. But OTs oftentimes don't work in mental health. I know that Jennifer, she does, and she's committed a lot of her career to that. but for the most part, OTs are found in hospitals, schools, early intervention, nursing homes. So, but I think that there's a place for OTs, even if they're not specifically trained in a psychiatric area. I think there is a spot for them to become involved in treating individuals with hoarding disorder, since we are very well trained in understanding function and how body structures and the environment impact doing everyday activities. Okay. So next up, we have current interventions and approaches. So first up, we have cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This is currently considered the most common intervention for individuals with hoarding disorder. It can help clients learn to observe and question their negative thoughts, emotions, and behaviors to ultimately lead to change and growth in challenging parts of their lives. Next up, we have CREST, which stands for Cognitive Rehabilitation and Exposure/Sorting Therapy. This works to address compensatory cognitive skills, exposure, and relapse prevention. Some specific tasks include using a calendar, making to-do lists, problem solving, meeting deadlines, and practicing sorting. Participants who completed CREST reported it as being helpful in their treatment. Next up, we have HART, which stands for Hoarding Action Response Team. And this was seen to be effective in reducing clutter, preserving tenancy, and reducing the risk of having a fire. Next up is the harm reduction approach. This is one that I know is very popular, and especially for individuals who might be working in home health. Just providing this list as a resource might be very helpful to clients, as home health OTs often have very limited time and a limited number of visits to be with their patients. So the harm reduction approach focuses on increasing a client's insight and awareness on home safety, reducing acquisition, and improving the client's relationships with friends and family. Next up, we have FAM, which stands for Family as Motivators. And this intervention is actually focused on training the family through 10 sessions that consist of psychoeducation, motivational interviewing, harm reduction, and family accommodation and prevention. Next up, we have the Desire approach. I learned about this from Linda Fay at the IO-CDF conference. So basically, this is another acronym that stands for Determine, Examine, Seek, Implement, Review, and Establish. So each of those kind of have a different component of how to kind of reduce and like get through hoarding treatment. Next, we have CFT and CMT, which stands for Compassion Focused Therapy and Compassionate Mind Training. So this was proposed by Dufresne at the conference last spring. And as a general overview, these two approaches focus on reducing negative feelings such as shame and self-criticism, while also increasing positive factors like self-compassion. All right, so again, with these, I think I'm going to just kind of read through, and if we have more questions later, we can come back. These are assessments that you can use with patients. And so the first one here, uniform inspection checklist, that actually correlates to what I discussed earlier. Then we have the Saving Inventory Revised, Hoarding Rating Scale, Clutter Image Rating, and Activities of Daily Living in Hoarding Scale. And then two others that I did not list on the slide also are the Home Environment Index and the Clutter Quality of Life Scale. Next up are resources. So some resources that I came across just throughout my project, as I was trying to learn more about hoarding and as I was creating these resources, included the International OCD Foundation. So as I've mentioned a few times, they have an annual conference, which I found very informative. I highly recommend going. It's really great because it has resources for volunteers, professionals, and those with lived experience. Next up, we have the Institute for Challenging Disorganization, or ICD. They have many resources and materials available, including the Clutter to Hoarding Scale and Clutter Quality of Life Scale. And they also have useful fact sheets. Lastly, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, provides educational mental health resources for those with mental health concerns, as well as their family members. And the thing that I really liked about this organization is that they offer support groups. So for those looking to work with individuals with hoarding disorder, there are a number of educational courses and continuing education units available online with general internet searches. Excuse me. For more formal certification, the ICD offers a hoarding disorder specialist program. So there are also a number of useful online resources. One that I found and I really enjoyed was a podcast called Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with @ThatHoarder. So this podcast is created by someone with lived experience over in the UK, and they provide just really great insights and tips. And I thought that this was very helpful to share with my clients, as it gives them someone who's able to relate to them, and it's not just me as their therapist, giving them advice. It's someone who understands maybe a little bit more than I do. Next, we have Clutters Anonymous and Help for Hoarders websites. So these again are supports for online purposes. And then next we have just looking into local resources. So for example, looking into local hoarding task forces such as yours, that might provide support to those with hoarding tendencies. And then also finding support groups in your local area. There are support groups for children of those with hoarding disorder. Clutters Anonymous, which I believe I mentioned just a second ago. And then there's also the Buried in Treasures curriculum, which is a very popular resource for individuals with hoarding disorder. They offer in-person and virtual groups nationwide. All right, so throughout my project, I also developed a number of resources. These do pertain a little bit more to occupational therapists, but I think that it provides an insight on really breaking things down. They're very thorough and detailed, and it could be interesting if you want to learn more about occupational therapy, as well as just really diving deep into some examples of hoarding situations. So the first one is an occupational profile. This document is typically used during an evaluation of a new client, and it addresses why the client is seeking services, successful and challenging occupations, their interests, values, goals, as well as supports and barriers the client has. Next up, I created an occupation-based activity analysis, which looks at specific activities and breaks them down into the smallest of details. Next, I also created a case study, which kind of goes through an older adult's experience with excessive clutter who is receiving home health occupational therapy services following a stroke. I also completed a literature review, an opinion paper, which basically discusses the OTPF and each specific occupation that is covered in that document, how that pertains to hoarding disorder and how OTs can help. And then also this presentation, I would consider a resource. It's very general, I believe, and provides a lot of foundational information. Lastly, I also conducted a research study, and I'm hoping to publish that. I haven't been dedicating a ton of time to that yet, as I've been studying for my boards, but hopefully once I pass those and get settled in with a job, I can return to writing that up. But basically, I looked at the prevalence of home health or of hoarding disorder in home health OT, and the results were very interesting. And I'm also willing to discuss that more later. And then here I have a QR code that you can scan for access to my project website, which contains all of those things that I've talked about that I've developed on that website. So, all right. So future directions for OT. All right. So future directions for OT. I think there are many ways that OT can become involved. The first, obviously, is to just collaborate with other professionals, because I don't think that a single profession is able to fully tackle this issue, and just working together to utilize the best of all of our knowledge and resources, I think, is the best way to provide the best treatment for our patients and our clients. So again, being equipped to address our patients' needs from a non-mental health perspective, such as just providing resources and referring to other professions, is also important. And lastly, continuing research on occupational therapy and hoarding disorder, I think, will be very beneficial, especially looking into researching areas such as the effectiveness of traditional occupation-based interventions, as well as interventions that focus on sorting and organizing tasks. Lastly, providing research on the effectiveness of working with other professions, and also from that, defining occupational therapy's role and value on interdisciplinary teams. All right, so a little bit more on my personal experience working with Catholic Charities in Milwaukee. They are, I believe, the nation's only program of its kind for hoarding intervention, hoarding intervention and treatment. So their program, I just basically would go to clients' homes with a home coach from Catholic Charities. And I would just assist clients in sorting and building skills for independent decluttering. Each client was different and had unique needs and situations. So I found that the values of occupational therapy aligned very well with what we were doing there, since occupational therapy looks at each individual to create a plan for improving their situation, and in this case for decluttering and learning how to manage their condition. I also just found that even though working at Catholic Charities was supplemental to my capstone requirements, I found it to be one of the most beneficial and enriching parts of my capstone experience, because I got to really see how the process goes. I got to work with clients and get to know them, and it was just a lot of fun. And it was also just very meaningful to me. All right, so as I kind of wrap up this presentation, I just want to take a step back and think about what can we do to improve the lives of those we encounter with hoarding disorder, and how can we promote their independence, occupational engagement, and their safety. I think the answer lies in utilizing our resources, continuing to research, and relying on one another to assist in solving individual cases, as they're each unique and complicated. whether you are an occupational therapist, another professional, a community member, a volunteer, a family member, or someone with lived experience, I hope this presentation was useful to you and helped you better understand the overarching components of occupational therapy, hoarding disorder, a snapshot of the present literature, useful hoarding disorder assessments, available resources, and future directions for OTs. And that is all. I again have my QR code listed here for my project website. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at nicole@terpstrahome.com. I'd love to even just talk about your experiences and insights, and maybe like what interventions have worked well for you, or if you're someone with lived experience, what you have found to be the most beneficial in your treatment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening. That is all.
Are you willing to take, are you willing to take a couple questions?
Yeah, for sure. Here, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. Okay, now I can see you again.
Could you speak a little bit about the team that you worked with in Milwaukee and what other types of professions were present? Because I found that really interesting when we spoke to Carla from Catholic Charities.
Okay, so I know that when I was there, they had restructured their program, so it's different now than how it used to be a few years ago. I know that in the past they had a, I think a licensed mental health professional, but now it's just Carla, who's the head of the program, the director, and then 2 home coaches who are also acting as the case managers now. So yeah, it was basically like those 3 individuals and then me and another intern. At times we would have other individuals like, I believe it was the president of Catholic Charities, or at least the head of that region. He would come in and discuss cases with us. But outside of that, I don't believe there were other professionals that I worked with. I did attempt to partner with a home health agency, and I did have a contract set up, but that ended up falling through. So I wasn't able to kind of bridge those connections.
Okay, do they still do a Buried in Treasures group with their participants?
At Catholic Charities?
Yeah.
Not that I saw, no. Okay. But I kind of brought that up a few times to like individual clients to see if they would be interested in joining like a local group, although I wasn't sure what local groups were occurring at that time necessarily.
We must have met with them pre-pandemic.
Yeah, I think a lot changed.
Like a key changed. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, thank you for sharing. It's really terrific.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope that it was applicable to you guys.
Oh,
see, does Dawn have a question?
Dawn has a question.
Yes, I just had an appointment with an occupational therapist this week for the first time. And the first thing they wanted to get through the disclosure was that a lot of what they do falls under a certain medical code, and that it is often not covered by insurance. It's called self-care. 97535. And I'm wondering, does most of the occupational therapy with hoarding, is it considered to be under that category of self-care that insurance tends not to cover?
So as far as insurance, I am not much of an expert yet. But I know that in my research, there was an OT who commented, I had one response that was open to just a written comment, and he said that perhaps under Medicare Part B, there could be some way to receive coverage for hoarding disorder services, but I don't know exactly what he meant or how exactly that would work as far as like specific codes. I guess I'm not sure exactly which ones are reimbursable by insurance. I don't know if Jennifer knows more about coding and reimbursement, but this is definitely kind of like an emerging area of practice for OT. So as far as figuring out how coverage works, it's a little bit still in the gray area as far as I know.
I guess
Okay.
I can speak to it a little bit. I bill for my program, we bill through caddy waiver services and DD and other waiver programs. But in our clinic, there are people who present with other mental health conditions, and hoarding may be a component of that. If you think about it, let's say a person has a difficult time with sorting in categories. We don't necessarily have to be sorting their things, but we can develop strategies and look at the cognitive processes that are interfering with sorting, and we can do that with other methods. And I mean, it could be with their things, but it could also just be looking at global categorizing techniques. For instance, if you're having a hard time because you don't have physical endurance due to the 1,000 reasons that a person might not have physical endurance, maybe we can build that up for you so that you do have enough energy to get a load of laundry done, so that you do have enough energy to finish cooking or cleaning up after a meal. And so I guess in terms of the billing, we're an outpatient clinic at my place, so I don't know if you're dealing with home health and they're saying that to you, but it's complex. And I guess sometimes if we address some of the other pieces, we can use hoarding behaviors as the vehicle for the improvements that we're making. But sometimes we're looking at a bigger picture than just teaching somebody exactly how to go through each item. When I'm in the home, I don't have to use those codes. And it's usually for somebody who's really at risk for losing their housing. So I wish there was more money out there for helping more people of various economic positions, but that's all I know. I'm sorry, I know I didn't answer your question, Dawn, but I did the best I could. We build self-care, we build therapeutic activity, we build therapeutic exercise, we build a whole bunch of other codes, and we actually don't have problems getting paid for self-care. I mean, learning how to cook or changing the way that you cook for yourself because of needing to make an adaptation is certainly something that keeps you in less expensive housing and keeps you healthier. So we do get paid for those codes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure why they're not.
Well, they had a hard time really explaining what self-care meant, but I'm guessing it's
Should be anything related to ADLs, to be honest.
Yeah. I just know it's very expensive per 15 minutes.
I agree with you. Healthcare is expensive.
Check with your
can
insurance
barely
first.
afford it myself. I totally understand. It's awful. We could have a whole other meeting on that. We might have different attendees. So. All right, Nicole, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing it. That was brilliant and awesome.